Thank you so much.
One thing, which is if you're remote and you have a question, use the chat.
Okay.
I'm done.
Yeah, thank you so much, Zoe, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Noreen, for inviting me. I'm so glad to be here. This is my first in-person seminar since February last year, and I will be around in the Center for Health and Wellbeing for the whole academic year, and I would love to have coffee or lunch with anyone. So this is a joint work with Pauline Tan at the National University of Singapore and Phil Cook at Duke University. This work is under the R&R stage, so we would appreciate any feedback. How did I get interested in the topic of sibling spillover? Well, growing up in China, I was the only child in my family. I remember those days when I was alone at home while my parents were busy at work. I was really a lonely kid, so I always had this imaginary sibling. So I always wondered how my life would be different if I had a sibling. So this is just a personal motivation to study the topic of sibling spillovers. Sorry. Okay. More broadly, understanding economic inequality has been the core in American social science research in the past half century. Although other contexts, such as neighborhoods and schools, are important, family is still the major channel through which economic inequality pattern is shaped. This figure shows the percentiles of family wealth from 1963 to 2016 in the United States. The average wealth has increased over the past 50 years, but it has not grown equally for all groups. During this time period, families near the bottom of the wealth distribution, meaning those at the 10th percentile, went from having no wealth on average to being about $1,000 in debt. Those in the middle more than doubled their wealth. Families near the top at the 90th percentile saw their wealth increase fivefold, and the wealth of those at the 99th percentile grew sevenfold.
So let me just interrupt for a second. It seems that the slides you're showing are
presented here. So it's showing the slides.
It's showing the next slide and the comments.
Oh, I see.
Because they're presented.
I can do it. Yeah, sorry.
You can see we have a lot of people on remote.
Yeah.
It's not showing.
I thought I can do the only share part of the screen thing.
Should show the whole thing right there. Oh no. Where did it go? Share screen. Oh, participant. No, close out of this. Click share screen. Not the whole thing. And then click this. Oh, you had it. Go back to basic.
You sure?
Click this. No.
Now it goes back to that second.
I think you need to switch to the slide over.
Yeah.
Then, yeah, then share screen and choose the,
Click slideshow.
Slideshow.
Stop share.
Stop the share. Go to slideshow.
Stop share. Start the slideshow.
Yeah.
And share.
Go back into PowerPoint. Nope. Back into PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You do it.
yes, then,
Sounds good.
then share the screen.
Oh, desktop too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Listen to this.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Existing scholarship on how family shapes inequality has concentrated on how spouses resemble each other, namely associative mating, and on the resemblance between older generations and younger generations, namely intergenerational transmission and mobility. how family members of the younger generations resemble each other, that is, the role of sibling correlations, is relatively less studied in the stratification and inequality literature. Strong sibling correlations in the long-term cognitive ability and economic outcomes have been documented, which account for as much as half of the economic inequality in the US. In the late 2010s, approximately 60% of households with children in the US have more than one child. The social process behind sibling correlations could be a key understudied pathway through which inter- and intragenerational transmission of advantages or disadvantages happen. Correlations between siblings may reflect similarities in biological endowment and shared family and school environmental characteristics, such as parental education, schoolmates' socioeconomic status, and academic performance, and parenting styles and values. A less studied contributor to sibling correlations is intersibling influence. An emerging literature, mostly in economics, provides evidence that sibling spillover effect exists for a wide range of human capital outcomes. Despite these latest studies, when siblings influence each other and which siblings influence each other the most are still unclear. Two questions in particular are relatively unexplored. First, does intersibling influence vary by children's school levels? Second, conditional on school levels, is sibling influence stronger or weaker in advantaged families or in disadvantaged families? The answers to these questions have important theoretical implications. The first question brings a life course perspective into our understanding of how siblings influence each other at different developmental stages and life transitions in childhood. The second question can help us understand whether and to what extent having siblings can mitigate or exacerbate disadvantages and how that varies as a function of family backgrounds. Broader social contexts in America, such as gender expectations, a rising divorce rate, a declining marriage rate, a rising economic cost of schooling, and structural racism, shifts family backgrounds, which further generates differential dynamics of sibling interactions and outcomes in advantaged and disadvantaged households. This paper is the first to explore how sibling spillover effects interact with household characteristics and children's school levels. We explicitly consider the following household characteristics: race, family structure, maternal education, and school poverty. Among these four aspects, race and family structure are closely related to family SES, and maternal education and school poverty directly measure SES. Our main analysis focuses on the effects of older siblings on younger siblings, because the literature suggests the sibling spillover effects operate in this direction. Our outcome variables are end-of-grade reading and math test scores between 3rd to 8th grade for students in public schools in North Carolina. We examined the causal effect of sibling spillovers on children's educational outcomes using a novel approach based on discontinuities in school starting age created by North Carolina school entry laws. So what is the natural experiment? Prior to cohorts born in 2004, the North Carolina attendance law specified that children born after October 16th could not start kindergarten until the year they turned 5 years old. Therefore, a child born on October 16th was eligible to enter school in August prior to their 5th birthday, whereas a child born on October 17th was not eligible until the following year. In any event, all the individuals in our data were born before 2004 and hence bound by the October 16th cutoff date. In reality, some children born shortly before the cutoff date delayed school entry, leading to imperfect subject compliance. So in our own sample, we estimate that approximately 92% of firstborns started school on time. So who are the 8%? From our investigation and other papers, most of them tend to be white boys with relatively lower academic abilities, but in rich families. Despite imperfect compliance, studies consistently show that school entry laws have substantial effects on the academic performance of untreated individuals born after the cutoff date, which diminish but remain highly significant up to the 8th grade. In the context of North Carolina, the estimated effect size is around 0.35 of a standard deviation. The increase in test scores is likely due to a relative age advantage, as students born right after the cutoff date then tend to be older than their classmates at the time of testing. They have higher levels of human capital accumulated prior to kindergarten and higher levels of cognitive development. Older siblings born shortly after the cutoff date also tend to have better mental health and exhibit higher non-cognitive skills. For example, they found that these children are less likely to have inattention or hyperactivity and tend to have higher task persistence. In this paper, we examine sibling spillovers by examining how having an older sibling born after the school entry cutoff date might affect a younger sibling's test scores. Let's first think about the potential mechanisms through which having an older sibling born after the school cutoff date might affect a younger sibling's test scores. And then we will discuss how each of these mechanisms may vary as a function of family social backgrounds and at different school levels. Based on our literature review, older siblings' starting ages are most likely to impact younger siblings' test scores through affecting older siblings' educational performance and health, particularly mental health and behavior problems such as ADHD-related problems. Other channels can be imagined but appear to be less supported by empirical evidence. So we can come back to this in the Q&A session if people have questions. Older siblings' improved academic performance may positively affect younger siblings' performance through role modeling or tutoring. Older siblings' improved academic performance may also negatively affect younger siblings' performance through backlash. So for example, if my brother is really good at academics, I may want to invest more time in sports or arts in order to draw my parents' attention to distinguish myself from my brother. Older siblings' improved health may positively affect younger siblings' performance through improving younger siblings' health. Besides these direct interactions between siblings, older siblings can also affect younger siblings indirectly through affecting parents' decision on allocation of household resources. Actually, I think 90% of the economics literature, when they examine sibling spillovers, they only focus on this household allocation resources model. Well, as we think about this question more from a sociological perspective. So what did this economic model say? So they said that the parental preference model provides two parental investment strategies. If the parents hold child-neutral preference, they would invest disproportionately in the child with the greatest talent or health to make sure they have a successful child. In this case, older siblings' better academic performance or health may lead to parents reinforcing behaviors, diverting household resources away from younger siblings. Well, there are another type of parents. If the parents hold child equality preferences, they would compensate the less talented or healthy child to equalize siblings' outcomes. In this case, having an academically successful or healthy older child may allow parents to devote more resources to the younger child. Now these theories, however, explicate how hypothesized mechanisms for inter-sibling influence interact with children's school levels and household characteristics. First, we hypothesize that sibling spillover effects are particularly strong in middle school, but not in elementary school. According to Aiker's social learning theory, In early formative years, young children are heavily influenced by older family members and other authority figures. By early adolescence, which is roughly the age of attending middle school, however, children increasingly seek independence from their parents and look instead to more similar age role models. Sibling and peer effects become more important in this stage. Older siblings' influence becomes more important when they reach middle school grades because they are more likely to be viewed as role models and they are more capable of tutoring. A large number of studies have documented the importance of older siblings' role modeling function among adolescents, even after taking peer influence into account. Our second hypothesis is that older sibling spillover effects are greater in disadvantaged families than in advantaged families. There are good reasons to believe all the mechanisms we talked about in the previous slide exist for both advantaged and disadvantaged families. We argue that the relative strengths of each mechanism varies by family backgrounds. Specifically, the 4 aspects of family backgrounds we're interested in this paper, race, family structure, maternal education, and school poverty, may create differential family experience and culture by affecting how parents define their own roles and their children's roles in the family life, as well as parents' time spent with children. We argue that among advantaged families, parents disproportionately invest better in children's human capital to obtain higher returns, and they compensate less talented siblings. Our theory is inspired by the rich discussion in the culture and family literature on how family SES affects children's life experiences. For example, according to Annette Leroux's work, higher SES parents typically pursue a cultivation approach, which emphasizes individualism within the family and encourages children to seek adult role models. Among these families, sibling role modeling, tutoring, or contagious positive attitude may also occur, but should be relatively small because children in these families can more easily find high-achieving school peers or adults to be role models and access other resources such as tutors. In addition, when older siblings are bad role models or have poor health, younger siblings from higher SES families may have a compensatory advantage and be less affected by older siblings' negative outcomes. For example, if the older sibling has behavior problem, parents in high SES families can protect the younger sibling by sending the older sibling to a boarding school. Among disadvantaged families, parents also divert their limited resources to the child they believe has better chances of achieving upward mobility, but with an expectation that this child will compensate other siblings by tutoring them or giving them financial assistance in the future. This expectation has been documented, for example, in Dalton Conley's book. Ethnographic work conducted by my colleague Eli Edson also suggests that in the face of structural racism, poor Black families often encourage their children to help each other, and older siblings tend to have a great influence on younger siblings. Qualitative family research also shows that older brothers often take the role of the father in single mom families. In addition, sibling tutoring is of particular value in disadvantaged families where parents may be less able to help younger siblings with their work than older siblings. Moreover, parents in disadvantaged families may not participate in children's activities as often as their counterparts in advantaged families, leaving child's play to children. Our own calculation using the PSID data confirm that siblings spend more time together in disadvantaged families compared to advantaged families. Finally, when the older sibling is a bad role model or has poor health, disadvantaged families do not have the same resources that advantaged families have to buffer negative sibling spillovers. We use an administrative data set from North Carolina, which links individual birth certificate records to public school administrative records. The birth certificate data provides information about individuals' birth weight and family background in terms of mother's race, age, educational attainment, and marital status at the time of birth. Crucially, the birth certificate data also allows us to identify siblings in the dataset who are born to the same mother. The public school administrative records provide individual level data on all end of grade reading and math test scores between 3rd and 8th grade. We measure each student's educational performance at these scores relative to the test scores of all students who took the same test, including students not included in our final sample. These scores are calculated for each grade by subject and then averaged across grades 3 through 5 for elementary school and grades 6 through 8 for middle school. Besides math and reading these scores, we create a variable indicating total test scores using the average of reading and math these scores to summarize overall achievement. The birth cohorts included in the final sample are born between 1987 and 2003. We restrict the sample to individuals born to non-Hispanic white and non-Hispanic Black mothers because a large portion of Hispanic and Asian public school students in these birth cohorts are born out of state, and hence we don't have their birth certificates. We also exclude students attending charter schools or schools in correctional facilities due to differences in testing requirements. The main analysis is based on students who have exactly one sibling who also appears in the dataset, which accounts for around 61% of all cases. We also conducted robustness checks, including students from larger families, and the results are highly consistent. Okay, so siblings spillover effects are difficult to identify due to the wide range of biological and environmental factors that makes it unfeasible to fully eliminate omitted variable bias simply by controlling for observed characteristics. We consider 4 broad categories of explanations for sibling correlations in academic outcomes. Category A is observed family and school environmental characteristics. Category B is biological endowment. Category C is unobserved characteristics such as parenting styles and values. The last category is influence of older siblings on younger siblings, both direct and indirect. We estimate the extent to which category A can explain these statistical associations between siblings using a rich set of control variables, including the individual's birth weight, maternal race, age, education, and marital status at the birth, and the student poverty, crime, and the grade passing rates at the school and the school district levels, as well as cohort fixed effects. To further rule out category B and C, and hence SLA D, we exploit discontinuities caused by North Carolina school entry laws. This slide shows the technical details. We can come back later if there are questions. Now let's look at the results for elementary school first. On this figure, the y-axis is younger siblings' test scores. The x-axis is older siblings' standardized birth date. The red line here indicates the school cutoff date. The 2 gray lines here define a 60-day window before and after the school cutoff date. The idea of the RE design is actually very intuitive. Imagining a world in which there was no school entry laws. The 2 groups were people, one born 60 days before the cutoff, and the other born 60 days after the cutoff, should not differ systematically in terms of test scores after controlling for ages and all the other household characteristics. Now, if we come back to the real world with the school entry law, if we observe a significant gap in test scores between these 2 groups, it must be driven by the school entry law. From this figure, the average test scores range from 0 to 0.2, reflecting a small variance of test scores, meaning of test scores among younger siblings against their older siblings' birthdays. You may notice that there is a hump in test scores between day minus 200 and minus 100. This observed pattern is highly consistent with seasonality patterns documented in previous studies. You may also notice that the variation in test scores is more monotonic within a 60-day window. This is actually consistent with our assumption that individuals in our sample share similar family backgrounds. We observe a gap at the school cutoff with a magnitude of 0.02 standard deviation, but this gap is not statistically significant. Now let's look at the results for middle school. We observe a gap at the school cutoff date of a 0.04 standard deviation, which is statistically significant at the 1% level. This indicates that having an older sibling born after the cutoff date is associated with an increase in the younger siblings' reading and math scores by 0.04 of standard deviation. The magnitude of the effects for reading is slightly larger, which is 0.044, than that for math, which is 0.037. So these results are consistent with our first hypothesis, which is sibling spillover effects only exist in elementary school, but not as obvious in elementary school. We also estimated that on average, students born right after the cutoff date have test scores higher by 0.15 of a standard deviation in middle school. This suggests that around 27% of the academic gains of older siblings spill over to their younger siblings. Because sibling spillover effects may depend on sibling configurations, we next present subgroup analysis by sibling configuration variables. We first compare our results for siblings who are 2 or fewer years apart with those who are 3 or more years apart. While the point estimates of sibling spillover effects between closely spaced siblings are larger, we do not find significant differences between coefficients across panels. We then look at the heterogeneous effects across sibling sex composition. Findings on the effect of sibling sex composition on academic outcomes have been mixed, with more recent studies finding larger effects between brothers and more generally between siblings of the same sex compared to those of different sexes. Our results generally support these findings, but also point to a more complicated picture. We do not find unambiguously larger effect sizes between brothers compared to between sisters, or between older sister and younger brother pairs. However, positive sibling spillover effects are significantly stronger for brothers pairs compared to those for older brother and younger sister pairs. For the latter, the point estimates of spillover effects are even negative. One potential explanation is that boys are favored to some extent over girls in many households due to gender norms, and therefore having an academically successful brother, particularly an older one, may lead parents to divert more resources to him. We move on to examine the second hypothesis by looking at heterogeneous effects by family backgrounds. We found consistent positive spillover effects in middle school across family background subgroups. Although many differences between subgroups are not significant at the 10% level, the estimates among disadvantaged families appear to be more robust and have larger effect sizes than those of advantaged families. In addition, positive spillover effects are significantly larger at the 10% level for single mom families and students in high poverty schools compared to two-parent families and students in low poverty schools. We also examined the spillover effects by each grade and find that the sibling spillover effects are the strongest in the 6th grade. This figure shows the results for the 6th grade by family backgrounds. The 6th grade marks the transition from elementary to middle school, a critical turning point towards peer influence on academic outcomes. We found evidence at this point that sibling spillover effects are stronger among disadvantaged families compared to advantaged families. Specifically, the effects are larger in non-Hispanic Black families than in non-Hispanic white families, in single mother families than in two-parent families, and for students attending schools with high poverty levels than those attending schools with low poverty levels. In general, all our results tend to support our second hypothesis, that is, sibling spillover effects are larger in disadvantaged families compared to advantaged families. After looking at all the results, we may ask how much can inter-sibling influence explain sibling correlations for disadvantaged versus advantaged families. Here, we focus on two comparisons that have important implications for inequality patterns in the United States. Single mom versus two-parent families, and non-Hispanic white versus non-Hispanic Black families. To estimate the relative importance of sibling educational influence in explaining sibling correlations in test scores, we need to examine how much younger siblings' test scores will change if their older siblings' test scores at the same school level improve by 1 standard deviation. Well, this is not very straightforward to do in our RD design, but this can be achieved by estimating an instrumental variable model. Here, we would note that the IV analysis requires a very strong assumption. That is, older siblings' school entry ages affect younger siblings' test scores only through older siblings' test scores. Our main results using the RD design, however, does not require this assumption. Okay, so in this figure, the raw sibling correlation in middle school test scores is 0.55 in our sample. Interestingly, the magnitude is consistent with studies on sibling correlations in cognitive ability in Europe and in the United States. The IV estimates on inter-sibling influence using the full sample is 0.19. This result suggests that more than 1/3 of the sibling correlation in test scores can be explained by inter-sibling influence. If we restrict the sample to siblings whose mothers were married at birth, the correlation in test scores is 0.54, which is just slightly smaller. The estimate of inter-sibling influence is 0.14, which suggests that approximately 1/3 of the sibling correlation in test scores can be explained by inter-sibling influence. By contrast, the correlation between siblings whose mothers were unmarried at birth is much smaller, which is 0.34. However, inter-sibling influence explains approximately 85% of the sibling correlation in test scores. One possible explanation for this greater relative importance of shared biological and family characteristics for two-parent families is that siblings in these families are more likely to have the same father and hence have a greater genetic overlap. Similarly, if we compare non-Hispanic white with non-Hispanic Black families, the sibling correlation in test scores is larger in the former, which is 0.53, compared to the latter, which is 0.38. But the inter-sibling influence accounts for almost 74% of the sibling correlation for non-Hispanic Blacks, whereas it only accounts for 28% for non-Hispanic whites. All these results suggest that sibling correlation in test scores is larger for advantaged families than disadvantaged families. While sibling correlation is mainly driven by shared biological, family, and community environments for advantaged families, it is mainly driven by inter-sibling influence for disadvantaged families. To conclude, this research is the first to explore how sibling spillover effects in education vary by both school level and family backgrounds, measured by maternal education, race, marital status, and school poverty context. We find that there are positive sibling spillovers for younger siblings in middle school, but not in elementary school. The overall sibling correlation in test scores are stronger in advantaged families, but the positive spillover effects are larger among disadvantaged families. Sibling correlation in test scores for the latter is largely driven by inter-sibling influence, whereas it is mainly driven by shared biological and family environments for the former. On average, around a quarter of a change in the older siblings' academic performance spills over to the younger siblings' performance in middle school. The spillover effect is even larger among students from disadvantaged families. Okay, so what these results tell us? These findings actually have very broad significance for social inequality. First, Our results suggest that more than 1/3 of the strong resemblance between sibling cognitive ability documented in previous studies may be causal, implying even higher overall returns to parental investment in children's human capital than previously estimated. Hence, sibling spillover effects provide an additional channel through which inequality of wealth and income translates to inequality of social and economic opportunity for the next generation. Second, in contrast with most existing theories that assume homogeneous sibling effects, the heterogeneous sibling effects we found in this study suggest that sibling dynamics differ among disadvantaged and advantaged families. What does it mean? It means that when bad things happen to older siblings, younger siblings in disadvantaged families suffer more compared to those in advantaged families. Existing studies have also shown that disadvantaged families, particularly older siblings in these families, are likely to suffer substantially from family tragedies such as illness, death, parental unemployment, and maybe COVID. This suggests that younger siblings in these families may not only directly suffer from the same family tragedies, but also experience negative spillovers from their older siblings. Therefore, it is important to provide a strong social safety net to disadvantaged families. Conversely, it also means that a public investment in educational achievement of the older sibling in the household will have a knock-on benefit of improving test scores of the younger sibling. This benefit will be particularly strong for Black, single mom, and low-income families. Therefore, investments of this sort could be directed to help close the test score gap among children in Black versus white, poor versus non-poor, and a single mom versus a two-parent household. Third, this is more like a methodology point. Social scientists have used sibling correlations as a proxy to measure shared family and community environments over the past 30 years. A related practice is a widely adopted sibling fixed effects model, aiming to remove variation due to shared family and community environments, and to some extent, genetic factors between siblings to obtain causal estimates. For these practices to be valid, the role of inter-sibling influence has to be small in explaining sibling correlations. Given the sibling effects found in this study and the heterogeneous pattern among families with different backgrounds, sibling correlations as a proxy for shared family and community environments and the sibling fixed effects models in general may be less useful than we thought, particularly in disadvantaged families. Fourth, this study contributes to the long-standing interest among sociologists, particularly demographers, in understanding how siblings affect individual outcomes. Much of the focus in this line of literature traditionally has been on the effect of sibling configuration, such as sibship size, sex composition, birth order, and birth interval, on individuals' academic achievement. These structural variables, although very important, do not explain the social and psychological processes through which siblings influence each other. Our study adds to this literature by looking at the role of policy interventions on siblings in explaining educational attainments conditional on sibling configuration variables, which provides us a better understanding of the underlying processes of sibling influence on school achievement. Finally, this study also ties into the literature on the effects of school starting age. Previous studies have documented that white males are more likely to have a relative age advantage because of the higher prevalence of red-shirting practice, meaning that they delay school entry. This may create a relative age disadvantage for Black students, which may negatively affect their test scores and lead to negative spillovers on their younger siblings' test scores. Policies increasing the absolute school starting ages have been shown to reduce the red-shirting practice and therefore reduce the Black-white test score gap among boys in North Carolina. These kind of policies are also likely to have positive sibling spillovers in Black families, further closing the racial achievement gaps. That's it. Thank you all for listening. I look forward to your comments and questions.